New Millennium Audio presents
Audrey Hepburn's Enchanted Tales.
I'm an old woman now. So old that what is past gets mixed up in my mind with what is now. When I remember my childhood, what I remember most is him. No memory is without Maurice Ravel, that small, dark, and elegant man who was to me the greatest composer who ever lived. In those years between 1906 and 1908, he would come often to La Grangette, our country house near Paris, to visit my parents. One day he came, very excited. "I have written a piano piece that I think you will like, Mimi," he said. "It's called Ma Mère Loi, My Mother Goose." It was all the stories I loved best, told in music. And then he showed me the front page. It was dedicated to my brother and to me. And now I sit, an old woman, outside in the orange late summer morning. The music in my mind is starting to play. I think of my wonderful Monsieur Ravel. I've heard tell of a castle that was covered with roses, Monsieur Ravel says to me. "The castle of the sleeping princess," I cry. "It is perhaps my favorite story of all. Oh, tell it to me, please." He smiles, draws me onto his lap, and begins the story of the sleeping princess. Once upon a time, a magic time, in a fair, far green country, lived a king and queen. They longed to have a child, and finally, on one bright morning in June, a daughter was born to them. "We must give her the grandest christening that ever was," the queen said. "We must even use the golden plates." And the king, who did not agree to much she suggested, agreed to this. Everyone in the land, all the townspeople, the nobility, the barons, were invited to the christening. But the most special guests of all were the 6 good fairies of the kingdom, the godmothers of the little princess. One by one, these fairies passed by the royal cradle and gave the baby a blessing and a gift. One promised the princess beauty, one a bright mind, one an even brighter spirit, one a voice to charm, one a loving heart. But just as the last fairy was about to bestow her gift, a quick, angry draught suddenly blew the door open. "Why, it's just the wind," laughed the king. But it wasn't the wind. It was a little old woman, thin as wind, perhaps, but so powerful that all the guests shrank back in fear of her. "Mélusine," someone whispered. "Mélusine," the choked cry went around. Mélusine was an evil fairy. She had disappeared from the kingdom many years before, and no one knew what had become of her. The king, hiding his surprise and fear, invited her in and hastily made a place for her at the high table. But he couldn't give her one of the golden plates, for there was simply not enough. Mélusine looked at the china plate given her instead, and she smiled, a very thin and awful smile. Hobbling up to the baby's cradle, she touched the child's cheek with her papery hand. "I, too, have a gift for you, my precious," the fairy whispered, "and here it is. One day you will prick your finger on the spindle of a spinning wheel and die." The guests shrank back, screaming. The queen fainted. Only the last of the 6 fairies was calm. She came forward slowly and faced Mélusine. "I have not yet given my blessing to the princess," she said softly. "Alas, I cannot undo the fairy curse, but I can surely soften it. The princess will indeed prick her finger on a spindle, but she will not die. She will only sleep for 100 years, until a prince shall come and wake her. 17 years passed, and the princess was now a young woman. She was beautiful, with tousled golden hair and flecked green eyes. She was honest and courageous, curious, tender, merry, and a little clumsy. Her favorite game was to explore the huge castle and make up stories about the queer things she found there. One morning in May, the princess was exploring a wing she had not been in before, and she came upon a funny little room. Inside sat an old woman spinning. The princess was enchanted by the strange sight. "What are you doing? Oh, do let me try," she cried, and rushed forward. In an instant her finger pricked the spindle. She gave a scream and sank lifeless on the floor. The old woman smiled, the cold, thin smile of the fairy Melusine, and melted into icy wind. The moment the princess touched the spindle and fell into a sleep, a strange thing began to happen. The whole palace began to sleep as well. The king, who was in the throne room making a new law, nodded off, still holding his quill pen. The queen, having her hair brushed by her lady-in-waiting, fell asleep at the dressing table. The lady-in-waiting fell asleep in mid-brushstroke, and on, until finally the whole palace was still, heavy and filled with dreamers. And then darkness came to those who dreamed. For up, like a wave of green, grew the brambles, climbing, unfolding, huge thorns raised. Up the vines grew, protectively, fiercely, until finally the whole castle was circled in their arms. And then even the brambles slept too. They slept for 100 years, slept through wars and warm harvests and marriages and new fashions, slept through the crown of the kingdom passing to a new family, slept through the birth of a new little prince. The prince's name is not important. What is important about him is his curiosity. From the time the prince was tiny, he had wondered and wondered about the huge castle in the kingdom, the one that was all covered with brambles. "Who lives there?" he asked. And when he was told the legend of the sleeping princess, he had smiled. "Ah," he said, "I shall be the one to awaken her." But everyone laughed at him, because he was only a tiny child, and his thumb wasn't even as big as one of the brambles that guarded the castle. But time passed, and one day the prince was no longer a child. He had grown into a man, well-favored and well-liked, but with a certain sadness always about him. The sadness was strongest when he rode into the wood and stood at the gates of that mysterious castle, thinking of the princess who lay inside. Many ladies in the kingdom were in love with the prince, but he could not return their love, for he had a strange image always before his eyes, the image of a bright-faced child whose hair was tangled yellow and whose eyes were flecked with green. On his 21st birthday, the prince left his celebration and rode as usual to the bramble-covered castle. As he stood looking, the longing filled him so much that he began to weep. "Let the brambles tear me apart," he thought. "If I must die, let me die trying to find the princess." The prince climbed the gate, rusted by years and disuse, and as he took his first step into the garden, something wonderful happened. The thorns which had been so angry and sharp only a moment before, melted into piles of rose petals at his feet. And the prince rushed into the palace. Dust he saw everywhere, gloomy spider webs and piles of sleeping people. He ran upstairs and searched the whole castle. And there, in the little back room, he found his princess, still lying beside the spinning wheel. He smiled when he saw her, for this was the girl who had lived in his mind all these years. He bent forward and kissed her, and when he drew back, a pair of merry, tender, flecked green eyes were looking at him. "I was just dreaming about you," the princess said. Down in the hallway below, the king yawned and stretched. "Oh, I must have dozed off," he said. "I have a law to finish." "Ouch," the queen said, as the handmaiden combing her hair pulled too sharply on a curl. The whole palace was stirring now, awed, wondering, amazed. "Are you ready, princess?" the prince asked. "Yes," she said. And hand in hand, they rose slowly and started down the long, curving staircase. I'm remembering a winter day. I gaze into the fire, and there the pictures of the past are dancing. It is December, right before Christmas. Monsieur Ravel comes to visit us. He is dressed in a new dark green topcoat, and his arms are full of gifts. There's something dull and adult for my parents, new music for my brother, and for me, the most wonderful little man made out of tin. When he's wound up, he can walk all around the table. Monsieur Ravel loves these mechanical marvels. His laughter at the little tin man is as loud as my own. "I know a story about a boy who was this tiny," he says to me. "Only he was not made out of tin. He was as real as you or I." So I jump onto his lap and beg him to tell me the story of Tom Thumb. Once upon a time, deep in a forest, there lived a woodcutter and his wife. They had 7 children, all red-haired boys. When business was going well, the woodcutter was delighted with his large family. But when things were going poorly, he was not so happy. "There are too many bellies to feed," he would complain, "too many feet to keep shod, too many backs to cover with clothing, and not enough money to do it." One cold winter, things became unbearable. Meals got plainer and leaner, clothes got smaller and more patched, and the woodcutter got more and more miserable. "Wife," he said one night, "I cannot sit by and watch my sons starve. Tomorrow, when I take them out into the forest, I will leave them there. Perhaps a wealthy merchant will find them and provide a better home." The wife wept and refused to go along with the plan at first, but finally she too gave in. The woodcutter went to sleep, not feeling at all happy with himself, but believing that he was doing the only thing he could. What he did not know was that one of his sons had overheard every word he had said. This was the youngest son, Tom. Now everyone, including the woodcutter, thought Tom was foolish, simply because he never spoke. And everyone also thought Tom was a weakling, simply because he was small. When he was born, in fact, Tom had been no bigger than a man's thumb, and so everyone called him Tom Thumb. When Tom heard his father's plans, he realized he had to save his brothers and himself. He sneaked out of the house and went to the stream that lay beside it. In the moonlight, the white stones on the bank glittered like a treasure chest full of undersea jewels. Tom filled his pockets with stones and returned to bed. The next morning, the woodcutter took his 7 sons deep into the forest. Every few feet, Tom would take a pebble out of his pocket. In the daytime they looked like ordinary brown rocks, and drop it on the ground. At noon, the woodcutter gave each boy a piece of bread and left them. "For a while," he said. None of the brothers except Tom noticed him weeping as he said it. The little while turned into hours, and soon it was night. The brothers came to realize that their father was not coming back, and they began to weep. Tom waited politely until they were finished, and then he said, "Don't cry. I will save you." His brothers had never heard Tom speak before, and they were amazed. Tom pointed proudly to the stones he had dropped. In the moonlight, they shone like a path of fallen stars. He and his brothers followed the path, and soon they were back home. The woodcutter, who had felt terribly guilty about what he had done, was glad to see them, and his wife nearly fainted with joy. "No matter how poor we become," the woodcutter said, "we will all stay together. I have learned my lesson." But unfortunately, he forgot it again soon afterwards. February came, the iciest, hungriest, most wolf-like February that had ever been. There was no work, no money, no food. "I can't stand seeing the children go hungry," the woodcutter roared. "Tomorrow I am taking the children out and leaving them in the forest." Again his wife pleaded and wept. Again he was stubborn, and again little Tom heard every word. Tom went outside in the freezing night looking for more stones, but the snow had fallen so heavily that the stones were buried beneath it, and he could not find even one. So he crept back to the house, not knowing what he was going to do. The next morning, the mother gave the children each a slice of bread for breakfast. Tom put his in his pocket. When the father took the boys out into the forest, Tom crushed his bread in his hands, and every few feet he threw down a few crumbs. Again the father led the children deep into the woods. Again he said he would return in a little while, and again he brushed away tears as he said it. When night fell and no father came, the boys all began to cry, except Tom. "Don't be frightened," he said. "I will show you the way back." He looked for the trail of breadcrumbs, but it was no longer there. The birds in the forest had pounced on the crumbs and had eaten them, every one. So the 7 children had to find their own way home. They walked and they walked through the heavy, freezing night. Suddenly Tom cried, "I see a light." Yes, it was a small, flickering light through the trees. The boys rushed forward and found themselves at the door of a huge, dark house. They knocked, and the door was opened by a woman. She had once been pretty, but fear had chased all her good looks away. "Oh, children, you must go," she said. "You have come to the house of a terrible ogre, a monster who eats little boys." Tom sighed. "Madam, we have just come from a forest which is full of wolves who also eat little boys. I would rather take my chances with the ogre." The ogre's wife, for that was who she was, sighed. "My husband is out for a little while," she said. "Come inside and at least warm yourselves before the fire." The 7 boys ran inside, and what a joy it was to rest their exhausted legs on the huge hearth and warm their chilly backs at the big fire. The ogre's wife warned them to stay awake, but their tiredness spoke with a louder voice, and soon they were fast asleep. Suddenly, there was a huge wind and a huge earthquake, and each little boy found himself caught up in a giant fist and gazing into a giant, glaring eye. The ogre had returned. "What is this?" the ogre roared. "Human boys? What a good woman you are, wife! You have caught me a fine supper." The wife was very frightened, but she pretended to go along with the ogre's idea. "Thank you, husband," she said, "but I meant these boys to be for your breakfast. As you can see, they're too thin and frozen for you to enjoy now. I thought that if they were given a good dinner and a good night's sleep, they would be delicious with your pancakes tomorrow." The giant was disappointed, but he agreed, because his wife was really an excellent cook, and she knew best about these things. The ogre's wife winked at Tom, and he winked back. She gave the boys an excellent dinner and put them to bed. After a sleep of several hours, Tom woke and nudged his brothers. "Let's go," he said, and the 7 children escaped. The ogre was a light sleeper, however, and he felt in his giant bones that something was wrong. In the middle of the night, he tiptoed in and found that his breakfast had escaped. Furious, he put on his 7-league boots and ran out of the house to search for them. Tom and his brothers had been running as fast as they could, but when Tom saw the ogre coming up so quickly behind them, he knew it was useless to keep on. He pushed his brothers and himself inside an old hollow log and waited. The ogre was getting tired from all his chasing, and as luck came to have it, he sat down to rest on the same hollow log where the boys were hiding. It felt so good to sit down that he took off his boots, laid them beside him, and had a little nap. Tom crept out of the hollow log and stepped into the 7-league boots himself. Now don't ask me how his feet fit the same boots that the ogre's feet had also fit. These boots were very magic, I suppose. But in a few moments, Tom was striding away across the fields and was back at the ogre's castle. "Oh, Mrs. Ogre," he said to the wife, "your husband has sent me with a terrible message. He has been attacked by robbers, and he says that unless you give me all your jewels and plate and gold coins to give to them, he will be killed." The wife was terrified, and she gave Tom all that he asked for. Tom returned to his brothers, got them out of the wood, and they all returned home with the ogre's treasure. Their parents were overjoyed to see them. The family was rich now, and there was no more talk about leaving the children to be raised by others. And as for the ogre, he may still be napping on the hollow log. So watch out next time you go into the woods. The afternoon is getting quite windy. Perhaps I shall take a walk later on. I love to walk in the wind. Monsieur Ravel used to love to walk as well. He did not enjoy the wind as I did. I remember one day in particular. I had been reading a book about pythons. I was walking along, and a twig snapped by my foot. I screamed, imagining it was the dreaded python come to devour me. Monsieur Ravel tried to reassure me, but I was still terrified. Finally, he said he knew a story about a very wonderful green snake, and that if I would only please stop carrying on, he could tell it to me. My crying stopped instantly. We sat down together on a bank full of wild flowers, and he began to tell me the story of La Laidronette, Empress of the Pagodes. Once upon a time, there lived a good-hearted king and queen who had twin baby girls. When it was time for them to be christened, all the important people and fairies in the kingdom were invited. But, as so often happens when people plan a big event, something gets forgotten. And what got forgotten in this case was the fairy Magotine. Magotine was the most black-hearted and sour fairy in the world, and even though she was not invited to the christening, she came anyway, in a black and sour puff of smoke. All the fairies but one had already offered their wishes to the baby princesses when Magotine appeared. She hobbled up to the cradle, touched one of the babies on the cheek, and cried, "My wish for you is perfect ugliness." And then she disappeared. The queen cried and screamed until the last fairy, the one who had not yet given her wish, said, "Your Majesty, maybe I can help. Here is my gift to the princess, that although she will be ugly, she will still find great happiness." And the queen had to be happy with that. Time passed, and the two little princesses grew up. The pretty one, Belette, was as dewy and freshly colored as a rose. But the other one, Laidronette, grew up to be so hideous that no one could bear to look at her. Finally, when she was 18 years old, she said to her parents, "I love you so much, but I cannot stand living here anymore. Please let me live as mistress of the castle by the sea. I shall be all by myself there, and there will be nobody's eyes to remind me of how ugly I am." The king and queen grieved, for they loved their daughter, but they let her go. Laidronette was happy at the castle. She was not lonely, for she had books to read, walks to take, her harpsichord to play, and her pet kitten to giggle at. One day she was taking her favorite walk through a leafy forest, when suddenly a huge green scaly serpent reared up in front of her. She screamed in terror and ran, shuddering, back to the castle. She never took the leafy forest walk again. The following week, Laidronette decided to take a swim at the seashore. Suddenly, as she was swimming, a wicked storm struck. The waves grew larger and larger, and Laidronette was afraid she was going to drown. Luckily, she saw a green log floating near her. She reached the log, pulled herself up, and to her horror, felt the log move under her. It was none other than the green serpent. Laidronette fainted. The next thing she knew, she was lying on a couch in a splendid white bedroom she had never seen before. And around her, smiling, were dozens of tiny creatures. They looked like Chinese idols. When she sat up, they bowed and curtsied to her. The bells on the little hats chimed most adorably. "We are the pagodas," they said. "We are here to make you happy." And they danced and sang for Laidronette, and she was enchanted. They led her to an even more beautiful apartment, which they said was for her, and they told her to call them any time she needed anything. Laidronette remained in Pagodia, for that was the name of the country, for several months. She was very happy there, but the longer she stayed, the more curious she became. "Who is your ruler?" she asked one day. "The king," the pagoda said. "It is he who told us to take such good care of you." "I would like to meet him and thank him," Laidronette said. The next day, she was taken to the throne room of the palace. The room was very grand, but the great throne was empty. "I hear you wish to see me," said a beautiful voice. "But it cannot be. The fairy Magotine has put a curse on me. For 7 years, no one can see me. 5 of the years have already passed, and there are 2 to go. I have been watching you these weeks, Laidronette," he went on, and I have grown to love you. Will you be my wife?" Laidronette was very pleased by his offer, and said that if she were given the chance to know him better, she might agree to it. For the next few weeks, she spent a lot of time with the king. Laidronette never saw him, but his voice was so beautiful and kind, his words so intelligent, that she found herself falling in love. The night before the wedding, the king said to her, "Remember the curse, my dear. For 2 more years I must stay invisible. If you try to see me before then, a terrible thing will happen. Do you understand?" "Oh, yes," she said. "I promise not to be curious." It was an easy promise to make, but it was not an easy promise to keep. For as the months went on, and Laidronette grew to love her husband more and more she wished to see him. One day, she was in the garden gathering roses, and the king was behind a trellis. Laidronette slipped quietly up and peeked through at him. And then she shrieked with terror and fell back, for there was her husband, the green serpent. "You have betrayed me," he cried in a sad, terrible voice, and then he disappeared. Miserable and ashamed of herself, Laidronette left the castle. For 2 years she wandered around Pagodia. One winter night, exhausted, she came to a small stream. A tiny fairy stood beside it. "This is the stream of discretion," the fairy said. "If you drink from it, you will once again be beautiful." But Laidronette was no longer interested in being beautiful. "The stream of discretion," she said. "If I had had discretion 2 years ago, I would never have broken my promise. I would never have looked at my husband. I would never have brought this tragedy upon us. Discretion is something I need. Perhaps this stream can give it to me." So she bent and drank. And the fairy smiled. "I'm very pleased with you, Laidronette," she said. "Instead of caring about being beautiful, your only thought was to be a better person, and so you shall be rewarded." Laidronette was given 2 wonderful rewards. The first was when she saw her reflection in the water. She gasped at the sight. She was absolutely beautiful now, golden and pink and perfect. And the second reward was the young man who came up and knelt beside her. As he spoke through happy tears, Laidronette recognized him by his voice. He was her lost and loved husband. The 2 of them embraced and cried and kissed. And they were happy together until the end of their time. It is nearly evening now. My servant has brought in tea, and my cat, Sido, has snuggled up to my side. Sido is old too. She loves warmth and peace and memories as I do. When I was a child, I had another cat, Heros. Heros was small and sleek, and he kept himself very dapper. "He's like me," Monsieur Ravel used to say. It was he who gave this cat to me. One summer, he was planning to go away on a trip, and so we would not be seeing him for several months. On the day he left, I was in tears. "Cheer up, little Mimi," he said. "What present would you like me to bring back to you from my travels?" "A cat," I answered. And sure enough, the day Monsieur Ravel returned, Heros was with him. We sat that afternoon, the three of us, in the nursery, the cat purring on my lap, and Ravel stretched out alongside us on the rug. "I know a story about another girl who was asked to choose her own present," he said. "But she chose something very different than a cat." "What did she choose?" I asked him eagerly. And, propping himself on one elbow, he began the tale of Beauty and the Beast. Once upon a time, in the days when France was covered with dark woods and darker mysteries, there lived a merchant with his 3 daughters. He had once been a wealthy man, and his daughters had worn the finest dresses in the kingdom. But recently, several of his ships had been lost at sea, and now all the money was gone. The 2 oldest daughters could not bear to be poor, and they did nothing but whine and complain. But the youngest daughter, Beauty, simply hung up her fine dresses and went to work. She scrubbed, she cleaned, she prepared meals, and she comforted her poor father in his sadness. Then one day he came to her with wonderful news. "Beauty," he said, "a miracle has happened. One of my ships has returned to port. Our fortunes have been restored. We will be rich again." He set off for the town at once. As he was leaving, he hugged his daughters to him. "What would you like for a present?" he asked. "A fine dress," said the first. "A rich jewel," said the second. But Beauty only smiled. "A rose," she said. "Only a rose." The merchant rode into the city and found that the miracle had not happened after all. Yes, one of his ships had come into port, but the spices and fabrics on board had been ruined by the salt water. So he started home again, even poorer than when he had set out. On the way home, he had to ride through a thorny black wood. A huge thunderstorm suddenly struck, and the merchant, already lost, became terrified. "I'll never find the way out," he thought. "I'll never see my daughters again." At that moment, a golden nerve of lightning shuddered through the sky, and the merchant could clearly see what lay in front of him. It was a castle, enormous and black. With his last bit of strength, he rode towards it. When the merchant reached the castle, he knew he had entered into a strange fairyland indeed. He was welcomed into the great hall, his dripping cloak was taken away, his horse was stabled, he was given an elegant dinner, and he was put to bed in the softest of sheets. But in all that evening, he did not see a single soul. All the work was done by ghostly, unseen hands, and he felt the breath of spirit all about him. In the morning, the merchant woke early. Afraid of the magic around him, he wanted to get back home as soon as possible. He dressed quickly, left the castle, and found his horse, beautifully groomed, waiting for him. But as the merchant was riding away through the garden, his eye fell upon a wonderful rose tree. He thought of Beauty and her wish for a rose, so he bent and plucked one. There was a sudden roar, a roar as terrible and as loud as last night's thunderstorm. The merchant looked up and screamed, for there, on the path, dressed in velvet and silks like a courtier, was the most hideous beast he had ever seen. The great monster came closer. "This is how you repay my hospitality," the animal roared. "I give you shelter, dinner, a bed, and you steal my rose. For that you will die." "Oh, spare me," the merchant cried. "I only wanted the rose for one of my daughters." A cunning look came into the beast's face. "You have daughters? Well then, I will give you a choice. If one of your daughters is willing to come back here in your place, I will spare your life. If they refuse, then you will return here to die. And do not think you can escape, for I have enchanted your horse. You will return here in 3 days with either your daughter or yourself." The miserable merchant got on his horse and rode home. When he told his daughters the story of what had happened, the 2 oldest cried and ranted and screamed. But Beauty was very calm. "The matter is very simple, father," she said. "The whole thing was my fault, and so I will go back to the beast's castle in your place." The merchant would not hear of the idea, but on the 3rd morning, before he was even awake, Beauty stole out of the house and jumped on the back of the horse, and by late afternoon she was at the castle of the beast. She found herself in the same strange fairy tale as her father had. She was taken inside the castle by unseen hands and led to a beautiful bedroom. The closet was full of lovely dresses, the shelves full of delicate treasures and interesting books. Beauty spent the day wandering around the grand castle and lush grounds, but still she saw nobody. That evening, when the clock struck 7, she was led by unseen hands into the dining hall. She sat down and waited. "Welcome, Beauty," said a low voice, and in walked the beast. Beauty was too kind to show the beast how much his ugliness frightened her, so she neither screamed nor ran away. She only thanked him politely for his kindness in making her so comfortable. He joined her at the table, and they talked through the meal. She was surprised to see what an interesting and amusing companion he was. At the end of dinner, he turned to her and said, with a look of great lonely sadness, "Beauty, will you marry me?" As kind as Beauty was, there was still only one answer. "No, beast, I could never marry you." In silence he walked away. The months that followed passed in the same way. Beauty's days were filled with loveliness, but also with loneliness. So, more and more, she began to look forward to her evenings with the beast. How kind he was, how they laughed together, how interesting he was to talk to. But every night he asked the same question, "Beauty, will you marry me?" And his voice seemed to grow sadder and more hopeless every time he said it. Beauty had grown so fond of him, and she hated to hurt him, but still her answer was always the same. "No, my beast, I could never marry you." As time went on, Beauty began to miss her family. One day, she asked the beast if she could go home for a visit. The beast grew very sad, but he gave his permission. "You must promise to come back in a month, though, Beauty," he told her with a strange smile, "or I shall die of a broken heart." Beauty promised and went home. Her family, who had thought her dead long ago, were overjoyed to see her, and she, in turn, was thrilled to find them in happy circumstances. Since she had been gone, 2 of her father's ships had come in, and the family was rich again. Beauty had a wonderful visit. It was so busy and so merry that never once did she think of the Beast. And then one night, a month to the day that Beauty had left the castle, she had a dream. She dreamed she saw the Beast. He was lying by the fountain in front of the castle, and he was dying. She heard him whisper, "Beauty." And she knew that his heart had broken, because she had not returned to him. Beauty woke from the dream, sprang out of bed, and dressed quickly. "Where are you going?" her sisters demanded. "I'm going to my Beast." Within minutes, she said goodbye to her father, had gotten on her horse, and was riding through the dark forest towards the castle. By daybreak she found it, chilly and damp as it had been in her dream. And there, lying by the fountain, was the still form of the Beast. "Beast!" she screamed. But it was too late. He didn't answer. She ran to him and held his heavy, hairy head in her arms. She looked at his face, the face that, when she had first seen it, she had thought was the ugliest in the world. But now all she could see in it was its kindness and its gentleness and its love for herself. "Beast!" she wept, and her tears fell on his fur. "Beast, you mustn't die. You must live. Live so we can be married. For I love you, and I want to be with you always." With those words, the Beast's eyes opened, and still weeping, Beauty leaned forward and kissed him. And when she did, something wonderful happened, for suddenly the Beast began to change. The furry body dissolved away, and there, lying in Beauty's arms, was not a hideous monster, but a radiant young prince. The prince gazed into Beauty's face with eyes that were at long last no longer lonely and sad. "Thank you, my Beauty," he said. "You have released me from a terrible spell." "Not I," she whispered. "It was love, and it released us both." fell asleep just now before the fire, and I had a strange dream. I found myself in a beautiful garden, the most beautiful garden I had ever seen. I heard laughter coming from in front of me, so I walked forward until I came to a large lawn. It was full of people. I felt very shy, so I quickly stepped backwards and hid behind a tree. What a wonderful sight it was! All the fairy folk were there. I saw Tom Thumb and his brothers sitting comfortably by the ogre and his wife. They were all laughing at some joke. I saw Beauty, one arm around her father, one arm around her beast prince, never to be separated from each other again. I saw the sleeping princess coming down the castle steps, hand in hand with her prince. And I saw Laidronette and her king, laughing at the dances of 100 tiny pagodes. And then suddenly, one pagode looked over, right at me, and pointed. All the faces turned toward me, smiling, curious. Shy and ashamed, I came out from my hiding place. Two of the pagodes took me by the hands and led me across the lawn to a large tree. And there, sitting on a chair beneath the tree, was my dear Maurice Ravel. "Hello, little Mimi," he said without surprise. "I have a story to tell you." I got onto his lap, and he began. "Once upon a time,